Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lessons, we're going to be covering something we've already covered before, the fifth and final chapter of the book of Peter, which, now the fifth chapter, we read of three main things. From verses 1 through 5a, we read of standards for shepherds. Shepherds are not a unique or original term amongst Christianity, but it's something we inherited from our Jewish forebears, and it roughly translates as a leader. So leaders of the church and their submission to the chief shepherd. We'll get into that when we get into that. Then we read of spiritual, victorious, foolproof strategic formulas for victoriously waging spiritual warfare. Peter has a lot of insights and resources and equipment and information that is useful in order for us to triumph over the world and overcome the devil and the flesh and all the rest. Then in verses 12 through 14, we read of a who, what, where, what formula. This is just the customary closing of the. It's his farewell address. Not too much theologically significant is in there, but it's still inspired, nevertheless. And this chapter serves as a bridge between the chapters which come before it and the book written by the same author, which comes after it. The main theme and one of the concepts I've been trying to develop in 1 Peter, I've been covering this book a lot lately, is the concept of sanctification through suffering and why suffering is necessary for salvation. And then in the second book of Peter, the enemy, this was a present reality they were dealing with. They had external forces aligned against them, and 2 Peter deals with the internal deficiencies, the false teachers. So expounding on in the opening verses about the standards for the shepherds, that forms a link, solidifying and bridging the two books. But he has something to say about the sanctification of suffering in the 14th through 19th verse of the previous chapter. I haven't done a lesson on this yet. That's my final one to do on 1 Peter, and I intend to do it soon, but we read of some of that. If you are reproached for the name of Messiah, bless, because the spirit of esteem and Elohim, or rather the 12th verse, beloved ones, do not be surprised at the fiery trial that is coming upon you to try you, as though some unusual matter has befallen them. This wouldn't have been a difficult concept to grasp to people who are living in the midst of persecutions, but the same applies and echoes to us. We should not think it strange when we are persecuted in even benign forms for our faith, because the world is at war with our witness, and they try and vomit and reject us out. We're on a collision course with the earth we're trying to redeem, and they persecute us, and this is the standard expectation of Christians in any era. But as you share Messiah's suffering, rejoice in order that you might rejoice exultingly at the revelation of his esteem. So the revelation of his esteem, now before the splendor there had to come the suffering, and if it was true for him, it is so too is us. If there's a cross in his life, there will be a cross in ours, perhaps not a literal one, although Peter personally did experience that death. He hung himself, according to legend, upside down, as he did not consider himself worthy to mimic the master. But there's just something about sharing the Messiah's sufferings. Paul speaks of the fellowship of suffering in Philippians 3:10 and perhaps in 1:29. So that unites us, and that's what makes us brothers. And we are united. We are not isolated, but there is a collective persecution when we enter into each other's pains and struggles, if only by empathy. And so we're just going to close with the 17th through 19th verse. Because it is time for judgment to begin from the house of Elohim, and if firstly from us, what is the end of those who do not obey the good news of Elohim? So therein we learn that the judgment comes to the house of Elohim first, that is the church. Those are the saints, these are the so-called Christians. We're the first to be judged, and some of us will be eliminated, some of us will be exalted and accepted. But if the possibility of even to us who if only nominally or physically belong to the house of Elohim, must be judged and can be rejected, how much worse is it going to be for those who do not obey the good news that we were committed to carrying and embodying? And then he just quotes, "And if the righteous one is scarcely saved, where shall the wicked and the sinner appear?" So I believe he says something similar earlier in the same chapter, and I used the example of Moses and David in the Corey Johnston 1 Peter 4 verses 1 through 11. For more on that, and we don't have time to extrapolate as fully as I already did. "So then, those who suffer according to the will of Elohim should commit their lives to a trustworthy Creator in doing good." So we have to have trust that our suffering will lead to our sanctification, and suffering is a fact of life. It is not automatically sanctifying. A lot of people suffer because of their own sin and their own stupidity. That is not suffering for the cause in the name or the sake of the name. There is a difference between suffering which sanctifies and suffering which only injures. The opening verse of the chapter we'll be covering today reads, "Therefore, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Messiah, and also a sharer of the esteem that is to be revealed, I appeal to the elders among you." Elders the term is not designated to those who are old in age, but those who are entrusted to exercise authority in church positions. These are leaders of local assemblies, perhaps not the equivalent of the head pastor, but servants and ministers nonetheless. And he identifies himself as a witness of the suffering. Remember the theme of sanctification through suffering. So the Messiah purchased our salvation because of his suffering on the cross. And Peter also identifies him as a partaker of the esteem that is to be revealed. And remember the formula we earlier extrapolated upon. The suffering has to precede the splendor for us as it did for him. And once more he qualifies that he appeals to the elders, the leaders among the church. So his target audience at this stage is specifically oriented towards people who are in positions of leadership and authority. "Shepherd the flock of Elohim, which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but voluntarily, not out of greed for filthy gain, but eagerly." So what we are to be as shepherds, and who we are to shepherd to is the flock of Elohim, and how we are to serve them is as overseers, which carries a distinctly slave-connected connotation, at least in the English language, but it is more generally and broadly defined as one who just oversees everything else. And the motive is important, not by compulsion. So if you have an ambition for ministry, that's okay. That's not necessarily viceful. But if your ambition is prideful or ulterior motivated, it's better to serve as a volunteer, not be motivated by filthy gain. It's not unrighteous to accept payment for your services as a pastor, but that ought not to be the motivating factor. Tragically, all the world's wealthiest religion, that's what they're all about, is money. And, they have a sense of eagerness too, but so too must we. "Neither as being masters over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock." So the servant leader paradox is expressed which was embodied by the Messiah and instructed as a model for his disciples, is what's being taught in this to people who Peter was instructing to lead and oversee churches, to do so as lead by example. That means to live, walk, talk, and do everything as something that is an example to be emulated by those who behold your walk, which is a witness to the flock, and do not exercise dominion. The rise of autocratic bishops would be another 2-3 centuries away, but there were forces in motion which were clearly generating towards that ultimate end in Peter's day. "And when the chief shepherd appears, you shall receive the never-fading crown of esteem." So that's when. The word "when" and not "if" signifies that it signifies the assumption that the chief, the shepherd, the local pastor, has ministered worthily as measured by, and befittingly and honoringly of the chief shepherd. That is a reference to Yahshua Messiah, who's going to appear and return. And on that day, if we did not, we who minister carry a greater burden of responsibility than the average saint. And we have to answer especially, and we are not exempt. Just being an ordained minister, it does not exempt one from hell necessarily. But if we do these things, if we do what we are instructed to do in the second and third verse, it's not an if, but when. And when, he's going to know, he's going to return no matter what. So the when, it's not if, but when. And he ultimately addresses somewhere in the third chapter the scoffers that have been with us more or less since every generation since, mocking about the second coming not yet coming to pass. So where is it? And it's never going to be, it's never been. In the same way, you younger ones, be subject to elders, and gird yourselves with humility towards one another. For Elohim resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So remember, our division is the standards for shepherds are in the first half of the fifth verse, then the spiritual warfare, the victorious insights and strategic formulas and insights and weapons and resources and mindsets to wage victorious spiritual warfare begin in the second half. So I just want to, the second half is a quotation, the first sentence reads, in the same way, you younger ones, be subject to your elders. Once more, elders is not necessarily the determining factor of elder is spiritual maturity, not physical age. And but young people should, as a general principle and rule, be obedient and subjected. And he says much about the need for the subjection to the government and of slaves to the masters and wives to the husbands in the 13th verse of the second chapter all the way to the 6th chapter of the third. So he has a lot to say about the need and necessity and rationale for obedience and submission. And then the part B reads, and gird yourselves with humility towards one another. So to gird oneself means to clothe oneself. That means we wear humility as our clothing. This is our visible witness is one of humility. And then he quotes somewhere in the Old Testament, I honestly forget where, Elohim resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. So that might be a proverb just because of its antithetical juxtaposition. There are two outlooks and outcomes. The proud is the outlook and humble is the other. And those who are proud will be resisted by an irresistible force, the omnipotent one, Elohim, the same being who will give grace to those who approach him in humility and are humble in their daily walks and daily lives. Humble yourselves, then, under the mighty hand of Elohim, so that he exalts you in due time. So just because we're all expected to be subjected to governmental authorities, slave masters, employers, the people who employ us, and also our spouses, that does not eliminate the primary allegiance above all else which is due under the mighty hand. So we are to humble ourselves under his mighty hand, and the paradox of strength through humility and victory through humility comes into play here, because it's under his mighty hand, and he will exalt us in due time. So we may have to suffer and live with the unfortunate side effects of the pain and the suffering for a while, but when it's all said and done, we will rest eternally in proximity to his exalted presence. Casting all your worry upon him, for he is concerned about you. This brings to mind Philippians 4:7, where Paul expounds on the necessary to eliminate the worry, because worry interferes. It is a hindrance to the true worship and true prayer. So we have to bring all our worry upon him, to him. He's the only one who can eliminate it and replace our fears and our anxieties and worries and concerns and negative expectations with faith. So faith will become fear when we cast our worries upon him. So we should say them out loud, ask God for whatever troubles besetting us, the vision and the path and the equipment and the resources to prevail over the obstacles which present themselves as a matter of course wherever we try to walk the straight and narrow. And of course, he is concerned about you. This is his motivating factor to eliminate our anxieties and fears and fill us with faith. Be sober, watch, because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Now, there is a lot. Satan is a frequently commentated on creature and figure throughout the Bible, both Old and New Testament. But in the New Testament, the most famous passages about his description is Paul's in 2 Corinthians 11, 13 through 15. The masqueraders, those who mimic him, Satan himself appears as an angel of light. But when all the mask and pretenses are removed, he is a carnivorous lion, our adversary. That means our enemy. He's a roaring lion, and he wants to devour us. Now, why is he motivated to devour and consume us and lead us unto spiritual death, eternal spiritual death? And the answer to that question is because he knows that he is doomed. So as the old adage goes, misery enjoys company. His mission and his purpose for existing is to drag as many angels and people, those who have moral agency, down there with them. He's always seeking to corrupt and can contaminate one's correct usage of moral agency to follow themselves in his path and his plan and to spread his kingdom. So God and Satan are at war, their followers are at war, and their kingdoms are war. And this instills sobriety, which means something more than mere abstinence from drugs or alcohol. It is an attentive alertness. It is soundness of decision and mind. These are attributes of sobriety in the broader sense of the word. And to watch, because he doesn't need an invitation to show up. He'll show up unannounced, uninvited, pretty much all the time, and often not even whisper that he is in your presence. So you have to watch, use your spiritual eyesight. So you're gifted with the eyes of faith, which can detect Satan's presence or his demons among you. And those who have traveled who have walked far on the straight and narrow will know that the devil walks about too. He walks around your path and sometimes within it, like a roaring lion, seeking someone, that's you, to devour and consume and discard for all eternity, to join him in his dreaded destiny of hell. Resist him, firm in the faith, knowing that the same hardships are experienced by your brotherhoods in the world. So we are to resist him. James says something similar in James 4, 7, or 8. So the presence of a spiritual antagonist demands that we not only resist him, but also engage him. We have to take the aggressive initiative on him from time to time. But whatever we do, whether we're resisting or engaging him, we cannot, when we're engaging him, we're also resisting him. And we have to maintain our firmness and the strength of the source of our strength, which is the faith. And we also have to be mindful that, when you're suffering pain and persecution, it has an isolating effect. It tricks and convinces and manipulates one into thinking no one else knows what I'm feeling, no one else is as bad off as I am right now. But the fact is there is a fellowship of suffering of Christians who bear the reproaches and rebukes of proclaiming the name to a world which is at war with him. And that is the brotherhood, the fellowship of suffering, which we may have already mentioned, Paul alludes to in Philippians 3:10. And the Elohim of all grace, who called you to his everlasting esteem by Messiah Yahshua, after you have suffered a while, himself perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. So he's the Elohim of all favor. Grace cannot exist apart from its origin, and all grace owes its origin to in him, who is uniquely qualified and competent to bestow upon us grace, which is the unmerited favor. And none of us deserve heaven, but it's made possible by his Son, who paved the path for us to go through faith. And as he suffered to accomplish our salvation, so too must we not expect not to suffer in the path to our salvation. But he is a perfect being in every way, shape, and form, and we cannot change him as a perfect being. That means he cannot degenerate or improve. We have nothing to teach him, but we cannot change him, but he can change us. So he is immutable in addition to his attribute of perfection. And through his perfection, he is able to rise us up and bring us home to him, where he longs for our return and wants to bring us. We have to meet him on his terms, though. Verse 11, to him be the esteem and the might forever and ever. Amen. So that's a prayer, a concluding verse for the second section of this book. He just wants all the esteem and the honor and pleasure and praise and the strength and the solace to belong eternally to the one who is eternal. And amen signalizes a conclusive conclusion to a thought. It also expresses an implicit unanimity of agreement. Now the third and final chapters, remember we have the who, what, where, what formula. So through Silas, the trustworthy brother, as I reckon, I have written to you briefly, encouraging and witnessing that this is the true grace of Elohim, and this stand fast. So Silas was his scribe. Peter did not physically write the epistles which bear his name, but they were physically written. They were verbally dictated, and Paul relied on the same thing. And Silas was one of Paul's missionary companions, and he is the one who is a faithful and trustworthy brother. He's the who of this formula, who faithfully copied and transpired the thoughts and the musings that Peter was expressing on his heart as inspired by the Spirit. And, you know, this isn't the lengthiest book in the Bible. It's 5 short chapters, but it is sufficient to encourage and witness. Remember, Peter identifies himself as a witness to the sufferings of Messiah in the opening verse. So that's what he and the written is the what. It's also the book. That's what this is all about. And this stand fast, that means stay the course, stay steady at the helm. There's going to be resistance, there's going to be obstacles, but you have the formula provided in the previous 5 or 6.5 verses to win. She who is in Babel, chosen together with you, greets you, also my son Mark. So Babel is the where. This is the location of this address, and I believe it's addressed to people in Galatia, Pontus, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. These are all places in the Roman province of Asia Minor, which corresponds to the modern country of Turkey. Nevertheless, this was Babylon would have been Rome, because the dangers of Christianity demanded that the writers resort to cryptic language, lest they should supply the Roman authorities with an explicit pretext to suppress them for preaching against them. And Mark was perhaps a convert, a personal convert of Peter's, but undisputably and undeniably a spiritual son of sorts. And it is the death of Peter which necessitates the writing of the gospel which bears Mark's name. Peter was Mark's primary source of information, which informs the gospel, which informs the one which comes after it and before it, significantly enough to belong in the same category of synoptics. That's another discussion. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace to all of you who are in Messiah, Yahshua. Amen. So a kiss of love is more, a kiss was a friendly exchange and greeting and farewell a friendly signal, but the kiss in friendship, he demands that they kiss in love, and he wishes peace and wellness and wholeness on all those who are in Messiah. He knows they're going through a lot right now, but the end's going to be worth it. The investment of suffering is going to be sufficient for their sanctification, without which their salvation cannot come. And amen. That's the closing thoughts. There's nothing left to say. There's nothing more to say, at least this time around. I may do a third draft yet, but not anytime soon. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.